Rezlife, Shannon here, your confirmation pastor. And today we are starting a brand new series to kick off the season of Lent. No, not like lint that comes out of your pocket or your dryer. Lent is the 7-week season leading up to Easter. And Lent is this time of reflection as we prepare to remember Jesus' death on the cross and celebrate his resurrection on Easter Sunday. And this Lent, as a church, we are reading through the Gospel of Luke. You can follow along with our reading of Luke by going to core.org/GPS. And there you can even sign up to get daily email reminders about what to read that particular day. Now, Luke is one of my favorite books in the entire Bible because it contains some amazing stories about Jesus' life that we don't read anywhere else. And we're going to talk about some of those stories in this series. Now, as we begin, I have a question for you. Have you ever felt like an outcast? Like an outsider? Like maybe you just did not belong? Now, when I was in middle school, I constantly felt like I didn't belong. Now, I'm pretty short now. You can't see it, but I'm actually standing on a box for this filming. But I was really short in middle school, like a good head shorter than most of my classmates. And I had this wild, frizzy, curly hair, and I didn't know what to do with it. I was not athletic, I was not sporty, and really, I just hadn't found my people. You know, those group of friends that you can journey alongside with through high school and beyond. I was picked on, I was teased. Middle school was not a fun time for me. Maybe you can relate. But I have good news. If any of this rings true for you, Jesus came for the outcasts. In fact, Luke's portrayal of Jesus was written specifically for outcasts and outsiders. It's all about how Jesus reached out and became friends with those on the margins, those people who the rest of society had shoved aside because they weren't popular or rich or pretty. Befriending the outcasts was literally the focus of Jesus' entire ministry. We see his heart for the outcasts in the very start of his ministry, from this first sermon he preached in his hometown of Nazareth. He was starting to get a reputation around town as a healer and a preacher and a teacher. So he went to the local synagogue, which was the place where Jewish people gathered to worship and pray. And here's what happens next. We read it in Luke 4:14-21. Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. Jesus went to Nazareth where he had been raised. And on the Sabbath, he went to the synagogue as he normally did, and he stood up to read. The synagogue assistant gave him the scroll from the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the synagogue assistant and sat down. Every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him. He began to explain to them, "Today, the scripture has been fulfilled just as you heard it." Now, I can imagine what it would have felt like in the room that day. It was probably so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. And everyone was holding their breath, and they couldn't wait to hear what Jesus was going to say next. Was he the one that they had been waiting for? Was he the Messiah that was promised and foretold about in Isaiah? Was Jesus going to set them free and overthrow their Roman oppressors? But as Jesus went on to explain, and you can read about it in the next few verses in Luke chapter 4, this good news he was talking about, this good news of God's favor, it was for everyone, not just the ones sitting in worship that day. It was for the outsiders, the outcasts, the sick, the poor, the freaks, the geeks, and yes, this good news was even for their enemies. Jesus was going to reach out to the ones that they had normally cast out of society, like lepers with skin diseases and poor widows that no one else wanted to take care of. He was going to correct the wrongs and turn their whole worlds upside down. He came to say that God's grace was for everyone, even the outsiders. Well, when the people heard this that day, they didn't like that, and they quickly turned on Jesus. We read on in Luke 4:28 through 30. When they heard this, everyone in the synagogue was filled with anger. They rose up and ran him out of town. They led him to the crest of the hill on which their town had been built so that they could throw him off the cliff. But he passed through the crowd and went on his way. Well, that seems pretty extreme. Why did the people react the way they did to Jesus' message? You see, these were the church folks, the good ones, the ones who got everything right, the ones who showed up on Sundays and didn't sin or mess up. They expected to receive God's grace and favor, but they didn't want to extend that same grace and favor to the outcasts and the outsiders too. Yet that was what Jesus said he was going to do. Jesus came for the outcasts. And after that sermon, Jesus goes on to do exactly what he says he will. He cares for the widows, he gives sight to the blind, he heals the sick, and even the ones no one else wanted to touch or get close to, he becomes friends with them. He becomes friends with the outcasts, and he hangs out with the outsiders. And he declares that God's grace and love is for everyone, including you. If we feel like an outsider or an outcast, sometimes we don't feel included in what Jesus is doing. We might say, well, that message of love and hope, that's for other people. It's not for me. But from the very moment Jesus walks onto the scene, he came for people who felt like they didn't belong. And for those who try to exclude others, Jesus has a message for them too. God's grace and love is for everyone, even for those we would rather leave out. We don't have to do anything to earn or deserve God's love. It is for insiders and outsiders alike, whether you are in the church every week or it's your first time here. I'm glad you're here, by the way. So over the next 5 weeks, we are going to look at these stories where Jesus intentionally includes the outsiders and outcasts. He makes friends with them. He even invites them to be his disciples and followers. We'll discuss these stories both here in Rezlife and in church, and also on our own as we read through the Gospel of Luke. I hope that you'll join with us as we look together at Jesus, friend of the outcasts, this Lent.